It was an ordinary afternoon at the gas station. David, a hard-working black man in his early 30s, had just finished his shift at the law firm and was heading home. He pulled into the gas station to fill up his car. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the scene. David went about his business like any other day, pumping gas into his sedan. He was just about to finish when, out of nowhere, two police officers pulled up next to him. They got out of their patrol car, walking toward him with stern faces. David didn't think much of it at first, assuming they might need something. But as the officers approached, he felt a sudden unease in the air. "Hey, what's going on?" one of the officers asked, his voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" David looked up, puzzled. "I'm just getting some gas." "What's the problem?" The officers exchanged glances, then the second one spoke up. "You're loitering. You can't be hanging around here for no reason." David was taken aback. Loitering? He had been at the station for less than 10 minutes, just pumping gas. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. But the officers didn't seem interested in hearing his side of the story. "I'm just filling up my car," David explained calmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The first officer stepped closer, his body language becoming more aggressive. "We're asking the questions here. Stay where you are." David stood still, trying to stay calm. He didn't want to escalate things. He had dealt with police officers before, but this situation felt different. The officers didn't seem to be interested in a peaceful conversation. Instead, their tone grew more hostile. The second officer, still standing back, radioed something in. David couldn't hear exactly what was said, but it didn't take long for the situation to spiral. Without warning, the first officer grabbed David's arm. "Hey, don't touch me," David said, pulling back slightly. He wasn't resisting, just trying to make his point. "I'm just trying to leave here peacefully." But the officer's grip tightened. "You're under arrest for trespassing and loitering," he announced, pulling out his handcuffs. "You've been warned." David froze for a moment, his heart racing. Trespassing? He had been on public property, buying gas, and now they were saying he was trespassing? He tried to keep his voice steady. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said again, but the officer wasn't listening. In an instant, he was handcuffed and shoved into the back of the police car. The officers didn't even give him a chance to ask what was happening. He felt humiliated and confused as he sat in the back seat, his thoughts racing. Was this really happening? As the car drove away from the gas station, David's mind began to churn with frustration. This was wrong. He was being arrested for no reason, and it was clear to him that this wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. This was something bigger. The officers didn't bother explaining anything further. They didn't need to. As a black man in America, David had often been aware of the way certain people in power could treat others based on race. But never in his life did he expect to find himself on the receiving end of such treatment. At the police station, David was processed. He sat quietly in a holding cell, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He was a lawyer, someone who had spent years fighting for justice, and yet here he was, locked up like a criminal. The absurdity of it all gnawed at him. How had this happened? What had he done wrong? Hours passed before anyone came to speak with him. By then, word had spread about his arrest. The local news stations had caught wind of the story, and soon social media was buzzing with updates. Supporters of David, friends, colleagues, and strangers alike began rallying behind him. They questioned the treatment he had received. How could someone with no criminal history, a respected lawyer, be treated like this? But while the news was gaining traction, David had no way of knowing how much this would change his life. He remained in the holding cell, trying to stay composed. He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was determined. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. But David was a fighter. And he wasn't about to let this injustice slide. As the night wore on, he finally heard the good news. Someone had bailed him out. His close friend, Marcus, who was a fellow lawyer, had arrived at the station to help. Marcus had been following the situation from the moment David had been arrested. He couldn't believe it either. The charges were flimsy and lacked any real evidence. David was finally released, but the damage had already been done. The humiliation of being arrested for no reason stayed with him. As he walked out of the station, the weight of the situation didn't feel lighter. In fact, it felt heavier. He wasn't just angry at the officers, he was angry at the entire system. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a part of a larger pattern of injustice that had been happening for years, maybe even decades. When David got home, he took a long look at himself in the mirror. He was a successful lawyer, but in that moment, he didn't feel successful. He felt like a victim of something bigger than himself. This wasn't just about one night at a gas station. It was about a system that needed to change. The next day, David received a call. It was from a local news station asking for an interview. They wanted his side of the story, but more than that, they wanted to hear what he planned to do about it. The question hung in the air: what would David do next? He didn't know exactly what that next step would be, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just his fight. This was a fight for every person who had ever been wrongfully targeted by the police, for every person who had ever been treated unfairly simply because of their race. David had been arrested for doing nothing wrong, but the next chapter of his life was about to unfold in a way that he never could have imagined. The battle was far from over, and David was ready to take on the fight for justice. The next day, after his release from the police station, David was still shaken by the events that had unfolded the previous evening. He sat at home, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the feeling of being wronged. The news had spread quickly, and soon his phone was buzzing with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. They all wanted to know the same thing: how could something like this happen? David had never imagined that something so humiliating and unjust would happen to him. As a lawyer, he was used to helping others navigate the system. He had spent years fighting for justice, working tirelessly to make sure people received fair treatment. But now, he had become a victim of that very same system. The anger he felt was not just about the arrest itself, it was about everything it represented. It was the fact that, in an instant, a law-abiding citizen like himself had been treated as a criminal. The fact that the officers had targeted him without cause, based solely on his appearance, was a harsh reminder of the racial biases that still existed in society. It was a bitter reality that David had always been aware of, but never fully experienced until now. As he sat in his living room, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. He knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was part of a larger pattern of injustice that had been happening for years, especially for people of color. This wasn't the first time he had heard stories like this, stories of innocent black men and women being wrongfully accused, arrested, or worse. But now, it wasn't just a story to him. It was his life. David knew he couldn't let this go. He had to do something. But what? He couldn't just walk away from this and pretend like it never happened. The weight of the situation was too heavy, and he knew that staying silent would only allow this injustice to continue. But what could he do that would make a difference? It wasn't long before David's phone rang again. This time, it was Marcus, his close friend and fellow lawyer. Marcus had been one of the first people to reach out to David after the arrest. He had been following the story closely, and he wanted to know how David was doing. "David, are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice full of concern. "I saw what happened yesterday, man. That's insane. I can't believe they treated you like that." David sighed, leaning back on the couch. Yeah, I still can't believe it either. It's like I'm living in a nightmare. I didn't do anything wrong. But they treated me like I was a criminal. I know, Marcus said sympathetically. But you're a lawyer, David. You know how this works. This isn't just about you. This is about all of us. And this is bigger than one bad experience. David paused. He knew Marcus was right. This wasn't just about his own humiliation, it was about the larger issue of racial profiling, systemic injustice, and police brutality. The arrest was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. I don't know what to do, Marcus, David admitted. I'm angry. But I also feel like I'm powerless. It's not just about me, but what can I do to change anything? Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. You know what you need to do. You need to fight. You need to show them that this won't be ignored. You've got the skills, David. You've got the power to make a difference. David didn't need to hear it twice. He knew that Marcus was right. He had spent his career fighting for justice, and now it was time to fight for himself, for his community, and for everyone who had ever been mistreated by the system. But how could he turn this moment into something bigger? That evening, after hanging up with Marcus, David made the decision that would change everything. He reached out to several local news outlets, sharing his story and the injustice he had faced. He didn't want to make it just about him. He wanted the world to know that this kind of thing couldn't continue happening to people, especially black men, who were too often seen as threats instead of innocent citizens. The story spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, social media was flooded with people expressing their outrage. David's face appeared on television, and people began rallying behind him. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he had become a symbol of resistance against the injustice that too many people faced every day. But as the story grew, so did the pressure. David knew that he couldn't just tell his story and walk away. He had to take action. It wasn't long before the local legal community took notice. David's reputation as a lawyer was well established, and his involvement in this case sent shockwaves through the city. People began calling for accountability, demanding that the police officers who had wrongfully arrested him be held responsible for their actions. Then came the unexpected call. The city had decided that David would preside over the hearing for the police officers involved in his arrest. It was a move that surprised everyone. How could a man who had been wronged by the system suddenly be put in charge of judging the officers responsible? The irony was not lost on David. It felt surreal. But it was also a call to action that he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just an opportunity to get justice for himself, it was an opportunity to change the system for the better. The news was a shock to David at first, but it also gave him the strength he needed to move forward. He couldn't back down now. He knew that this hearing wasn't just about the two officers who had arrested him. It was about sending a message to the entire city, and perhaps even to the entire nation. This kind of behavior couldn't be tolerated anymore. As the date for the hearing approached, David began preparing for the trial. He spent long hours reviewing the case, organizing evidence, and making sure that he was ready to stand firm in the face of the officers' defense. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he couldn't let the system continue to fail those who had been oppressed for far too long. David wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for justice. He was fighting for those who had been silenced, for those who had been wrongly accused, for those who had never had the chance to speak up. He was fighting for a world where everyone, no matter their race, could feel safe and respected. The battle was far from over, but David was ready. He was no longer the victim. He was the judge. And he was about to make his voice heard. The courtroom was filled with tension. Reporters, local citizens, and legal professionals packed the seats, eagerly waiting for the hearing to begin. David stood at the front, dressed in a dark suit, looking every bit the professional he had always been. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just a lawyer representing someone else. Today, he was the judge. And the weight of that responsibility hung heavily on his shoulders. David had never imagined himself in this position. Being a judge wasn't something he had planned for. He had spent years in the courtroom, defending clients, fighting for justice, and advocating for those who couldn't speak for themselves. But now, the tables had turned. It was his turn to deliver justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. As he took his seat behind the judge's bench, David looked across the courtroom. The two police officers who had arrested him, Officer Green and Officer Hayes, were seated at the defendant's table. They were both in uniform, but there was an air of unease about them. They exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable under David's watchful gaze. David's eyes scanned the room. His legal team, which had been working with him tirelessly, sat behind him. Their presence was a comfort, but today was his day to lead. This wasn't about them, it was about what was right. He had spent too long fighting for others. Now, it was time to fight for justice in the most personal way. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Rachel Sims, stood up to address the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "we are here today to seek justice for Mr. David Wilson, who was wrongfully arrested and mistreated by the officers seated before us. The charges against him were unfounded, and the actions of Officer Green and Officer Hayes were not just unlawful, but deeply unjust." David nodded, his expression calm but firm. He had already heard the details of the case, but hearing them in the courtroom made everything feel more real. He had felt the sting of that night in the holding cell, the confusion and the humiliation. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the larger issue. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through what he had experienced. The defense attorney for the officers, Thomas Reed, stood up next. "Your Honor," he began, his tone smooth and practiced, "we are not denying that there was a confrontation. But we believe that the officers were merely doing their job. They suspected Mr. Wilson of loitering, and when he refused to cooperate, they had no choice but to act. They were just following protocol." David's mind raced. He had heard this defense before, the claim that the officers were simply doing their jobs. But it didn't add up. If they were doing their jobs, why had they treated him with such aggression? Why had they escalated the situation to the point of arrest when there was no evidence to support their claims? Rachel Sims stood up to challenge the defense. "Your Honor, we have video footage from the gas station that clearly shows Mr. Wilson was not loitering. He was simply pumping gas. The officers had no reason to approach him, and their actions were not only unjust but illegal." This was an example of racial profiling at its worst. David watched as the video footage was displayed on the screen in front of the court. It showed him standing at the gas pump, minding his business, when the officers approached. The footage was clear there was no loitering, no suspicious behavior. He hadn't even been given a chance to explain himself before the officers moved in, hands on their weapons, ready to make an arrest. The tension in the courtroom grew as the video continued. David could feel the eyes of everyone on him. This was his moment. He was in charge now, and he had to make the right call. It wasn't about revenge or anger, it was about ensuring that justice was served. The video ended, and David leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, but he didn't let it distract him. This wasn't about his emotions, it was about the truth. "Officers Green and Hayes," David began, his voice steady, "your actions that night were not only unprofessional, but they were also unlawful. You had no right to arrest Mr. Wilson. There was no probable cause, no evidence of any wrongdoing on his part. What happened at that gas station was a clear violation of his rights." There was a sharp intake of breath from the defendant's table. Officer Green looked down at his hands, his face pale. Officer Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. David could see that they were beginning to realize the severity of the situation. But it was too late for regret. The damage had been done. Furthermore, David continued, the way you treated Mr. Wilson was disrespectful and prejudiced. This was not a case of law enforcement doing their job, it was a case of racial profiling. And that is unacceptable. No one should be treated this way, regardless of their race, background, or appearance. The defense attorney stood up, clearly flustered. Your Honor, we cannot accept these allegations. The officers were simply following standard procedure. There was no intention to target Mr. Wilson based on his race. They acted in good faith. David shook his head. Intentions don't matter here. The facts are what matter. And the facts tell a different story. This was an unjustified arrest. It was an abuse of power, and it's my duty to hold you accountable for that. There was a long pause in the courtroom. The silence was thick, and David could feel the weight of the decision he was about to make. This wasn't just about a single arrest, it was about the future of the justice system. It was about sending a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. He turned to the prosecutor, Rachel Sims, and nodded. I've heard the evidence, and I've considered the facts. I'm ready to make my decision. Rachel's expression softened slightly, but David could see the respect in her eyes. She knew this was a difficult moment for him, but she also knew that he was the right person to make the call. David looked back at the two officers. Officer Green, Officer Hayes, you are guilty of misconduct. Your actions that night were not only unprofessional but also illegal. You will face the consequences of your actions, and I will ensure that justice is served. The officers' faces dropped. There was no denying it now. David had made his decision, and there was no turning back. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but David remained calm. This was what needed to be done. This was about restoring faith in the system, about proving that justice could be served, even when the system itself had failed. He turned to the audience, his voice steady. This is not just about one arrest. This is about every person who has ever been wrongfully accused, every person who has ever been treated unfairly by the system. This is about making sure that the law is applied equally to everyone, regardless of their race. And this is just the beginning. David knew that the road ahead would be long, but he was ready for it. Today, he had made a stand. Today, he had used his position to ensure that justice was served. As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs following the verdict, David remained at the bench, his gaze steady. The officers, Officer Green and Officer Hayes, sat motionless, their faces pale as they absorbed the weight of the judgment. It was clear they hadn't expected things to unfold this way. For them, this trial had been a formality, a routine matter they thought would be dismissed. They were wrong. David's thoughts were clear but heavy. He had done what was right, but he couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about one arrest, it was about a larger problem, a pattern of racial injustice that had been allowed to fester for too long. As the judge, David had the authority to make a decision, but the challenge now was ensuring that this decision wouldn't just be an isolated victory, it had to spark real change. The room fell silent as David waited for the defense to respond. Officer Green and Officer Hayes remained seated, the weight of their failure sinking in. The prosecution team, led by Rachel Sims, exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of David's decision. They knew it wasn't just about this one case, it was about the system as a whole. The defense attorney, Thomas Reed, stood up once again. Your Honor, he said, his voice more strained than before, we understand that the court has found our clients guilty of misconduct. However, we ask that you consider leniency in their sentencing. Both officers have served for many years with no prior incidents, and this was an isolated situation that was mishandled. We request that you allow them the opportunity to make amends. David didn't flinch. He had anticipated this plea for leniency. The officer's long service was irrelevant. Their actions had been wrong, and that was what mattered. He had to make sure that this case set a clear example, that the consequences of misconduct were not watered down by the officer's years of service or their regret. "Mr. Reed," David said, his voice firm, "I understand your argument. However, we cannot allow the actions of a few to go unpunished simply because of past service. The misconduct displayed here was serious, and it cannot be dismissed as a mistake. What happened that night was a violation of Mr. Wilson's rights, and that cannot be overlooked." There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere in the courtroom. People leaned forward, waiting for David's final decision. He knew what had to be done, but it wasn't an easy choice to make. This wasn't just about punishing two officers, it was about sending a message to the entire police force and the wider community that there would be consequences for unjust actions. David understood the deep responsibility of his position, and he knew that this decision could either make or break the change that was needed. David took a deep breath before continuing. "Officer Green, Officer Hayes, you both will face disciplinary action. You will be suspended from duty pending further investigation, and you will undergo extensive retraining on racial sensitivity and the use of force. Your actions were not only unprofessional, but they were harmful. You violated the trust that the community places in law enforcement, and that trust must be rebuilt." A sense of unease spread throughout the courtroom. The officers' faces had lost all color. Officer Green opened his mouth to speak but quickly closed it, unsure of what to say. Officer Hayes, who had been quieter throughout the trial, looked down at the table, clearly processing the weight of the judgment. David stood up slowly, his posture rigid. "This hearing is not just about two officers, it's about something much larger. It's about the systematic issues that exist within law enforcement, and it's about the way that people of color are disproportionately affected by these injustices. My role as a judge today is to ensure that this court not only holds you accountable but that it stands as an example for the future." David's words hung in the air, the silence in the courtroom stretching as everyone absorbed the weight of his message. He wasn't just delivering a verdict, he was challenging the system. He was making it clear that injustice would not be tolerated. "The community," David continued, "expects better from those who are sworn to protect and serve. This case is not an isolated incident. It's a part of a much larger pattern of behavior that must be addressed head-on. I am not just sentencing these officers today. I am sending a message to every officer, every lawmaker, and every citizen: we must do better. We must hold each other accountable, and we must demand justice for all." David paused, allowing his words to settle. The room was still. The eyes of the courtroom were all on him, some filled with admiration, others with discomfort. But David knew this was a pivotal moment. The fight for justice didn't end with this hearing. It was just beginning. The defense attorney, Thomas Reed, looked defeated as he sat back down, realizing there was no point in challenging David's decision further. Officer Green and Officer Hayes sat in their seats, their expressions blank, as though they were still trying to come to terms with what had just happened. Rachel Sims, the prosecutor, stood up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Your Honor, thank you for your firm stance on this case. We hope that this will set a precedent, not only for the city but for communities across the country. We hope that your decision will encourage others to continue the fight for justice." David nodded, his expression thoughtful but resolute. "Thank you, Miss Sims. But the fight is far from over. This is just one case. There are many more like it. And we must ensure that the system is reformed so that this kind of injustice doesn't happen again." With that, David rose from the bench and made his way out of the courtroom, leaving behind a room full of people who had witnessed a turning point. As he walked down the hallway, he could feel the weight of his decision. But he also felt something else, a sense of purpose. He had made a stand, and it felt like the right thing to do. In the days that followed, the community responded to David's verdict with widespread support. People took to social media to praise his actions, and protests erupted in support of greater accountability for law enforcement. The case became a symbol of hope, a sign that change was possible, even when the system seemed unmovable. David, however, knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The work was far from over. But as he sat in his office, reviewing legal documents for his next case, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. He had made a difference. And while he knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, he was ready. Ready to keep fighting for justice, ready to continue challenging the system, and ready to ensure that the voices of those who had been wronged would never again be silenced. The days following David's decision were filled with media attention, community support, and a sense of change in the air. News outlets, both local and national, covered the case extensively. David's name became known not just for his profession as a lawyer but for his role in standing up against injustice. His actions were being praised by many, and yet, David knew this was just the beginning. Despite the overwhelming support, David remained focused. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. What mattered to him was the change his actions might spark. The courtroom had been the first step, but there was so much more work to do. He had spoken about reform, but now it was time to actively be part of that reform. David spent the next few weeks meeting with other lawyers, activists, and community leaders. He attended town halls, listening to the concerns of everyday people who felt the same weight he had felt during his arrest. He knew that while the officers were facing disciplinary action, true change would require collective action from all sectors of society: law enforcement, politics, and the public. There needed to be a shift in how people saw the law and how they expected justice to be delivered. One evening, David sat down at his desk, reviewing notes from his meetings. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it. It was a text message from Marcus, his close friend and fellow lawyer. David smiled, glad to hear from him. "Marcus, hey man, how's everything going after the verdict? People are talking, and I've heard a few whispers that some folks want to bring you into bigger projects. You in for something that could change the system?" David stared at the message for a moment, then replied with a simple, "Let's talk tomorrow." It wasn't that David didn't appreciate the attention or the offers to get involved in high-profile cases. But his heart was set on the long-term work that was needed. Legal battles were important, but so was making sure that this moment wasn't just a flash in the pan. As he put his phone down, David leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the days that had led up to this point. The arrest, the trial, the verdict, it felt like a blur. But in that blur, there had been moments of clarity. David had realized that the work of justice was ongoing, and he was ready to take it further. Later that evening, David met with Marcus at a local cafe. The two sat across from each other, sipping coffee, their conversation easy but filled with the weight of their discussion. "You've made a name for yourself, David," Marcus said, looking at him with admiration. "This case has changed things, but it's clear you're not stopping here. What's next for you?" David looked down at his cup before meeting Marcus's gaze. "You know what I'm trying to do," he said. "I've been thinking a lot about what's needed. There's so much more that needs to be fixed. Yes, this was a win for me, but it's just one case. We need to focus on police reform, on helping the community heal from years of distrust. I want to make sure that these types of things don't happen anymore. I don't want to just be known for one case, I want to be part of the change." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "You're talking about reform on a larger scale. You know that's a battle, right?" David smiled. "I know. But it's one that's worth fighting. I'm in a unique position now, and I want to use that. If I can make even the smallest difference, it will be worth it." After their conversation, David's resolve only grew stronger. In the weeks that followed, he dedicated himself to finding ways to bring about the change he knew was needed. He collaborated with activists, holding workshops and forums where members of the community could come together and discuss their experiences with law enforcement. David didn't just want to listen to their stories, he wanted to use them as fuel for a movement. A movement that demanded change, fairness, and accountability. One of the first steps in his plan was to reach out to local lawmakers. He attended a city council meeting, standing at the podium and speaking not just as a lawyer, but as a person who had been directly affected by the system. He shared his story and explained the need for changes to police procedures, transparency, and accountability. He wasn't there to argue or blame, he was there to offer solutions. He spoke about the importance of body cameras, the need for better training on racial sensitivity, and the importance of independent review boards for police conduct. The room was quiet as David spoke. His words carried weight, not just because he was a lawyer but because they came from personal experience. He wasn't just someone reading from a script, he was someone who had been on the receiving end of the system's failures. And he had come out the other side stronger and determined to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. The response from the city council was cautiously optimistic. They promised to look into his suggestions and work with the community to create a task force aimed at improving police practices. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. David knew it would take time, but he was in this for the long haul. Weeks turned into months, and David continued his work. He made headlines for his efforts, but it wasn't the fame he sought. His heart remained with the community. He knew that real change couldn't come from a single decision or case, it would take a sustained effort to change attitudes, laws, and practices that had been ingrained for far too long. One evening, as David was leaving a meeting with other local leaders, he received another call from Marcus. This time, his voice was more serious. "David, there's something we need to talk about," Marcus said. "I've been hearing rumors. The police union is pushing back. They're not happy with the way you've been handling things. They're trying to make an example out of you. You need to be careful." David's heart sank. He had expected some pushback, but this was the first time he had heard about a concerted effort to discredit him. But even as he felt the weight of the challenge before him, David remained resolute. "I'm not going to stop," David said firmly. "This isn't just about me anymore. This is about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. If they want to challenge me, then I'll meet them head on. We can't allow fear to dictate how we move forward." The next day, the pressure intensified. David was publicly criticized by some law enforcement groups for his stance on police reform. But instead of backing down, David's commitment only grew stronger. He addressed the criticism with calm resolve, continuing to speak out for justice and change. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but he also knew that every challenge brought with it an opportunity to make a difference. Through all the turmoil, David found solace in the support of the community. People reached out to him, thanking him for his efforts and sharing their own stories of how the justice system had failed them. David realized that he wasn't just leading a movement, he was a part of a much larger collective of voices that had been silenced for too long. Together, they could make change. Together, they could fight for a system that treated everyone fairly, regardless of race. As David looked out at the city, he saw a future that was different from the past. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But change was possible. And David Wilson, once a victim, was now at the forefront of that change. The fight was far from over, but David was ready to keep going, because he knew that every step forward brought them one step closer to the world they all deserved.